People got here early and you're eating, so we might as well just get started. We were really worried about having enough time to do this in an hour, so we'll just start a few minutes early and we'll get started. Hi, I'm David Lujan. I'm the president and CEO of Children's Action Alliance, and we are so grateful to have all of you here today and to take time. Having run for the legislature many times myself, I know what a busy schedule you all have and how much of a demand on your time this is, so we really appreciate you taking the time to be here tonight. Also, particularly if you're a Suns fan, being here during the Suns playoff game. I profoundly apologize. I am one of the biggest Suns fans in the world, so you would think that we would not schedule this at the same time. And I said, well, there might be a Suns game that night, but if it is, it's going to start at like 6:30 or 7 o'clock. There's no way it would start at 4:30, but here we are. So, but thank you. We really appreciate you being here, and we wanted to start by just going around the room and very quickly just giving you a sense of who's here today. So if you would just go around and say your name and whether you're running for House or Senate and the district. And we'll start with Flavio.
Hi, everybody. Flavio Bravo, running for state representative in District 26.
Ajan Cordolo, you can call me AJ. I'm running in Arizona State House in LD 12.
Hey everyone, Christian Solorio, I'm the state representative for Legislative District 30, and I'm running for Legislative District 26.
Mike Vogel from, excuse me, Legislative District 1, Yavapai County, running for AZ Senate.
Kathy Ransom, State House, Legislative District 1, and I've also introduced my invisible, our third member of our slate, Neil Sinclair, who is actually chairing his annual meeting of the startup that he is CEO of, where they are trying to develop clean energy public transit. So he's not here for a really good reason tonight.
Great.
Hi, good evening. My name is Marion Brannings. I'm running for Legislative District 11, South Mountain, Maine.
My name is Dave Ruby. I'm not running as a campaign manager for the state in Yavapai County.
Paul White, I am running for the House Legislative District 12.
And I'm Suzanne Blunt, and I'm running for the House, LD 14.
My name is Seth Flatman. I'm running for state representative in the new LD9.
Heidi Contreras, running for Arizona House in the LD 12.
Kyle Nitschke, I'm running for State Senate in the LD 7. I'm up in Flagstaff and stretches all the way down to Globe, Arizona and Apache Junction.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Loretta Austin. I'm running for House of Representatives in the new LD9, which is West Mesa. Hi, everybody. I'm Annalise Ortiz, a Democrat running for the Arizona House of Representatives in the new LD 24, which encompasses Far West Phoenix, Maryvale, and Glendale.
Hi everyone, Mariana Sandoval, I'm running for the State House. District goes from Goodyear to Yuma, South Tucson, and it includes Toconora.
Hi, Natasha Chavez. I'm running for the State House in LD 22, which is parts of West Phoenix, Tolson, Avondale, and now we also have a small portion of Glendale as well.
Hi, I'm Mayor Marquez. I'm currently a school board member right here in Phoenix Union and running right here in LD5 for State House.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and have our staff, you'll meet some of them during the presentation, but some of them you won't. So I think it's good if we just go around and have you introduce, starting with Brianna.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brianna Miller, and I'm a health policy specialist here at Children's.
Hi, I'm Zeta. I'm the Director of Health Policy here.
Hi, I'm Kylie Barber, I'm the Early Childhood Policy Director at Children's Action Alliance.
I'm Kelly Murphy. I'm the Vice President of Policy at Children's Action Alliance, and welcome. We're happy to have you here.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mia Curry. I'm the Vice President of Development at AG
And it doesn't make me feel old at all that 3 of the candidates here I've known since they were in high school, but it is great that you're all here. So we have a lot of issues policy issues that Children's Action Alliance and the Arizona Center for Economic Progress care very deeply about, and we could have you here probably for 4 or 5 days going over them. We have an hour, and hopefully we want to try and get you out by this 4th quarter of the Suns game. So the whole point of today really is just to let you get to know us and get to know our staff and get to have a flavor of the issues that we care about. And know that we want to be a resource to you when you're elected to the legislature. Our organizations are 501c3 organizations, so that means we are nonprofit, nonpartisan organizations. We can't endorse candidates. We can't get involved in partisan campaigns, and so we didn't ask you what your party affiliation. I know we have candidates who are SVP today that are in both parties, and so when we do these types of events, we invite all candidates, and when you get elected to the legislature, we offer our services or our resources to all candidates as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. And I will tell you that we will not get to everything today. We have some portions where we'll do questions and answers, but we will have our staff around at the end if you have any questions that you want to ask on any particular issues. But I will make the offer that we always make to all candidates, regardless of party, that we are available to you as you're running to get more resources. And you'll hear at the end a link that we'll give you to resources on these various issues. And so we are just glad that you're here to learn about them. Our hope is that as you are campaigning, you will talk about these issues with the voters in your districts. Because I can tell you that the issues that we work on are very important to the voters in Arizona, whether it's education, whether it's budget and taxes, housing, healthcare. Poll after poll shows that these are the issues that the voters in your districts want to hear from you about and want to hear your positions. And so if we can be a resource to you in learning more about these issues and make you feel more comfortable to start conversations with the voters when you're knocking on their doors, then that is mission accomplished for us, because we really want to make sure that you are talking about the issues that are important to us. And I think if you do that, you'll find that your voters will respond, because that's the issues that they want to talk about as well. So before we get started, just a little bit more. Children's Action Alliance has been around in Arizona advocating at the state capitol for 33 years. You're going to see that the issues that we work for and advocate for are in pursuit of an Arizona where all children and families can thrive. And the Arizona Center for Economic Progress is a little bit younger. It's been around now for 5 years. It's an embedded organization within Children's Action Alliance, and its focus is to focus on connecting the dots between the budget and tax decisions that are made at the state capitol and how that impacts the revenues that we have for resources that Arizonans count on to be able to move up the economic ladder and to create thriving communities. And so you're going to hear from our staff today as they go through some of the policy areas that we cover and that are important to us. At the end of each of those sections, we are going to open it up to any questions and answers that you may have. I can tell you, though, we're going to limit it, because if we want to get out of here in an hour, and I know from experience that when you have a room full of candidates, the question and answer session can get out of control at times. So we are going to really limit it, but I will tell you and I promise you that if you don't get your questions answered, we're available afterwards. And as I said, we're going to give you a link to more resources, and throughout the campaign, we want to be a resource to you if you need more information on any of these issues. So we will go ahead and get started, and I'm going to start by introducing Zeta Pecoro, who's our Director of Health Policy for Children's Action Alliance. Zeta.
You don't have to clap for me. Hi, can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, wonderful. I'm the guinea pig for testing the AV system, so give me just a minute. Wonderful. So as David mentioned, my name is Zeta. I'm the Director of Health Policy here at Children's Action Alliance, and I really think that Children's Action Alliance fills a niche in our community that's really dedicated not towards one specific children's health issue, not towards a particular topic, but really towards promoting equity among kids in our state and families. So to that end, we really feel that healthcare should be affordable. We think it should be accessible. And we think that the public healthcare systems that we have in our state should be accountable to taxpayers and to residents. There are a lot of different things that impact access to care in our state, but these are the 5 that we butt up against the most in our work. One of them is age. So right around age 13, kids start to fall off of health coverage. They stop going to the doctor for those routine visits and screenings. And that is really to the detriment of us all, because we know that they're still growing, they're still developing, and they still need that pair of eyes on them. Geography is huge as well. I know there are a few folks from our more rural parts of the state here today. Rural Arizona struggles with maintaining providers, maintaining an adequate workforce, as well as with transportation and many other barriers. And then parent coverage status. So I always joke that kids tend to live in households, right? They usually live with adults. So when the parent has health coverage, the child is much more likely to have health coverage as well, or the caregiver. Income is huge. About 10% of the kids who are uninsured in Arizona right now are earning just a little bit too much to qualify for Medicaid or CHIP. And that's a tremendous area of opportunity that we've been exploring for a couple of years. And then culture. So I like to think about this from the background of somebody coming to this state, coming to this country for the first time and encountering our healthcare system, or maybe, who grew up in a more rural part of the state in a tribal nation. The term health insurance is really spooky, right? Like, if you're coming at this for the first time, it sounds like a scam. And I've heard that from a number of people that we've talked to. They're like, what? You want me to insure what? It's not the same here as it is in many other places. And so really what we're trying to do is shift that culture and promote awareness and understanding of why healthcare is important for children and families. So nationally, about 5% of kids are uninsured. Here in Arizona, about 9% of kids are uninsured. So in 2019, we ranked 48th out of the 50 states in Washington, D.C. for our rate of children's health coverage. And we know that some things have shifted at the federal level. We have seen the rate of uninsured kids grow since 2016. And that's not true across the board, right? So right now, about 1 in 4 American Indian or Alaska Native kids in our state is uninsured. And that is despite being disproportionately more likely to qualify for public health insurance programs. The rate of uninsured Asian and Pacific Islander kids in our state has doubled in recent years. And I want to just point out that, we have a tremendous population, particularly of children who are Hispanic or Latino in our state. Almost 11% of them are uninsured, and that's one of the faster growing groups that we're seeing a rise in the number of uninsured children. Just a quick overview. I know I bore everybody to death with this, but everyone gets confused about Medicaid and Medicare, so we'll just talk about it now, get it out of the way. Medicaid covers both adults and kids who meet certain criteria. It's based on residency as well as certain citizenship requirements, can't say that word today, and income. And Arizona's Medicaid program is called the Arizona Healthcare Cost Containment System, which gives you a pretty big clue about what its purpose is, right? It's not called the Arizona Everyone's Healthy System. We pronounce that access, and our children's health insurance program is a little bit more specific. So this is slightly different. It's housed within access. We call this program in Arizona Kids Care. You may remember a few years back there was a freeze on kids care during the Great Recession. It has now been restored, and we are continuing to see growth in that program. The big difference here is that parents or children who participate in kids care do pay a small monthly premium to participate in that program. So they're typically children whose families have slightly higher incomes, but maybe not quite enough to qualify for coverage through other sources, or maybe not. Maybe they don't have access to employer-sponsored health coverage. And then Medicare covers adults over 65, as well as some younger people who meet disease-specific criteria or condition-specific criteria. So a child can have both Medicare and Medicaid, or Medicare and CHIP. There we go. I want to just stress that when we are talking about cuts to Medicaid, when we're talking about cuts to CHIP, we are talking about cuts to the healthcare programs that are ensuring 53% of American Indian and Alaska Native kids in our state. This is a race equity issue, and these programs, cuts to these programs has a disproportionate impact, not just on this generation, but for many generations to come. So I'll show that to you in just a moment, but I'm happy to come back to this. I'm going to speed through it for a moment. We now have about 50 years of data, not in Arizona. We were the last state to adopt Medicaid. But we have about 50 years of data that show that children who were covered in their youth do better than their uninsured peers for up to 50 years. So this is an investment that continues to pay for itself over and over and over again. We see that in reduced adult mortality, reduced use of disability resources and payments. We see higher high school and college graduation rates, especially when we cover kids with slightly higher incomes. And then we also, I think really importantly, see an intergenerational impact. So children who were covered in their youth give birth to healthier children themselves. So let that sink in for a moment. And this is in particular coverage through Medicaid and CHIP. I want to just also stress that in the first year of the pandemic, almost 114,000 U.S. kids lost at least one primary caregiver to COVID. So that's either a caregiver parent or a caregiver grandparent, and that's at least one. Many lost more than that. So when we're looking at this long term, when we're looking at access to healthcare now, what we need to be talking about is the long-term impact on these children and their ability to build resilience and continue to grow and continue to live their best lives. I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have. Yeah?
Will you be sharing the PowerPoint?
Yes, we will. Yeah. I think there's actually a QR code somewhere in this presentation. So, yeah.
You said, or what is the amount that the 8% threshold is just above in terms of the monetary income?
Sure. So Arizona's CHIP program, bear with me, this gets a little wonky. We cover children up to 200% of the federal poverty level, and then there's a standard 5% income disregard. So effectively, we cover kids up to 205% of the federal poverty level in our CHIP program. In Medicaid, it's up to, it depends on age, but typically kind of we would say like 138%. Certain age groups might qualify at higher incomes. That is one of the lower rates of CHIP income eligibility in the nation. And we've seen many states, including big red rural states like Arizona, extend coverage and income eligibility up beyond 300% of the federal poverty level. And it's really no surprise that those states tend to have very low rates of uninsured children. I like to look at, I was born in Alabama. I like to look at Alabama as a benchmark. They have about 3% uninsured kids, and they have taken their Medicaid program or their CHIP program income eligibility up to 300% of the federal poverty level, and instituted other measures that reduce some of the administrative burden on families, and really just help facilitate getting children into coverage. So I don't think that this needs to be a partisan issue, is what I always say. It's really about making sure that we're getting our kids the best opportunity to be healthy now and in the next generation.
What is the dollar amount though?
It shifts every year. I'd have to look it up, and it also varies by household size. Does anyone happen to have the FPL chart up? I know, it's always open in like a tab in my phone because I have to look this up like every 15 minutes.
I bet it's around $80,000 a year would be 205%.
I think it would depend on the household size for sure. One of the things that I think is really interesting is that to qualify for a CHIP, you have to earn less than the median income in Arizona. So we're really kind of knocking out a bunch of people who could qualify based on income. But again, that doesn't weigh the different factors of household size and child's age and types of earnings.
You can include the FPL chart in the resources. We'll add it to that list so you can look at it. There's a chart that shows all of that.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
It's also worth noting that, particularly for tribal members, certain types of income don't count. So if you're getting, if you're making the majority of your household income through the sale of traditional crafts or foods, that doesn't count towards your income qualification.
Are all tribal members not covered? Tribal members?
Tribal members,
Are they
so.
not all covered?
So that's a really tricky question, and we could probably do like a whole nother presentation on this, but which I'm happy to do. The Indian Health Service was established kind of with the intention of providing health care to tribal members in perpetuity. This has been in U.S. treaties, federal government treaties with tribal governments for centuries, I think it's safe to say. Centuries, decades, it really gets reinforced over and over. The biggest thing that we see, though, is that those programs have never been fully funded to meet the needs of our tribal populations. So when you start talking to tribal members, you'll hear kind of, I thought this was just an Arizona thing. It's not. It's throughout the nation. Representatives of different tribes will say, like, if you're going to get sick, you better do it by June, because that is when the entire healthcare system runs out of money. At any given point in time, our tribal healthcare systems. Sorry, what?
Sounds like the VA.
Yes. There are a lot of similarities. Yeah. And at any given point in time, about 20 to 30% of positions in tribal health facilities are vacant, and that's during non-COVID times. So it's really hard to keep a health center running at full capacity with 65% of the staff that you need. I can't do math clearly. 70% of the staff you need. Somebody, yeah, AZ Center team. Somebody correct me. Yeah, so I'm happy to talk about that more, and we can do a deeper dive. But I got my time called, so thanks. I'm going to go ahead and introduce my colleague Molly Dunn.
Okay, welcome everybody. So nice to see you here. I am going to talk about child welfare in Arizona. And
Molly, you might need to lean into the mic.
oh,
There we go.
sorry about that. I have got an unauthorized setup here with my notes. So when most people think about child welfare, they think about the Department of Child Safety. And the Department of Child Safety is definitely at the center, but our child welfare system is actually much broader than that and really can be thought of as maybe 3 different systems. So you've got your child protection system. That is the folks who are responding to allegations of abuse and neglect, primarily through investigating those mandated reports that come into a hotline. And then you've got the child welfare system. That can encompass investigation, but it would also include caring for children who are in foster care, providing services to their parents so that they can reunify with their children, and that full array of services focused on children who are in the foster care system. And then finally, you've got the child well-being system. And this is still at this point quite aspirational, but the idea is that if we can proactively strengthen families and provide them with what they need, we can eliminate or at least drastically reduce the need to have a child welfare system or a child protection system. And we'll talk more about that as we go through here. So the Department of Child Safety was created in 2014. I think you all probably know it happened on the heels of a child welfare crisis in the state where we had skyrocketing numbers of children entering foster care. I would say, and I think many others would, that was directly tied to the very, very deep budget cuts that we had during the Great Recession, and all of that stress that put on families is what caused more and more children to need to enter the foster care system. We have federal oversight. It's the Administration for Children and Families, specifically within that, the Children's Bureau. You may all have heard of someone named January Contreras, who now heads up ACF, and we are in Region 9. Now, the federal oversight is generally only of federal dollars and how those dollars are being spent, but there is significant federal funds coming in, and in Arizona, we're all combined, so there's almost nothing that is purely state-only funds. So if you ever want to read DCS's 5-year plan that they need to submit to the feds, that provides you with a pretty comprehensive blueprint of what is planned for child welfare activities in the state. It is a couple hundred pages long, though. The sources of funding you see here, and I want to pick out what's kind of most important about this funding. Title IV-E funds are specific federal dollars for foster care, and they make up the largest portion of federal funds. You can see that state and local funds are, in Arizona, we're at 55%. Nationally, that's 43%, so we're drawing down a bit more than other states are. A couple other things of note is that Arizona, like I just said, draws down a higher percentage of Title IV-E dollars. We also use a higher percentage of TANF funds. So those are your general welfare funds. We divert those funds to child welfare. Many states use TANF funds for child welfare, but we do so at a pretty significantly higher rate than most other states do. And then the last thing I'll share with you about funding is that the state's share of costs go up every year. And that's because federal funding is actually tied to 1996 eligibility for welfare benefits as they existed then. And so each year, fewer and fewer children are deemed federally eligible, and that impacts how much the state can claim in reimbursement dollars. But long story short, because of the way the federal funding has worked since 1996, Arizona is, and every other state is on track to pay a higher percentage of the share in child welfare funding. It's impacted by this system. It's always surprising to people to hear the raw numbers. So there are over 150,000 calls to the DCS hotline every year. About a little less than a third of those result in reports that require investigation. And then only a small fraction of those result in a child entering foster care. The majority of calls to the hotline are for neglect, not abuse. And in fact, among children who are in foster care in Arizona, 87% of them are there because they experienced neglect, not because they experience physical or sexual abuse. We have a very high disproportionality in Arizona's child welfare system for Black children. We have high disproportionality for American Indian children at the hotline call level. That seems to get corrected in terms of young people in foster care. But for Black children, calls to the hotlines are over 3 times greater than Black children's share of Arizona's child population. So, when you think about the cumulative risk of contact with the child welfare system by the time you're 18, it's pretty enormous and shocking. So a study came out this past summer that looked at the 20 largest metropolitan areas in the United States. And that study included Maricopa County. And what they found is that by age 18, 4 out of every 10 children in Maricopa County will experience a CPS investigation. 40% in this county right here. For Black children, that number is 7 out of 10. So if you're a Black child growing up in Maricopa County, the odds are much greater that you are going to be the subject of some kind of contact with a child welfare system than that you're not.
Is that a one-time count of kids, or is that?
No, there's some pretty complicated methodology around that, but it is a peer-reviewed study, and this is what they found. Arizona was by far an extreme outlier with regard to children being sent into foster care and termination of parental rights. So when I think about the child welfare system, I have come to think about it as the last safety net, right? When children, or research does show that when economic supports, TANF, childcare, housing are in place, families do better. They have less stress. They have less of that economic hardship. And that means that fewer children enter foster care. When those concrete supports or that social safety net isn't in place, we see higher rates of children entering foster care and being separated from their families. This is the child welfare crisis that I talked about that gave rise to our standalone Department of Child Safety. Some different people have different narratives, but I think anyone who's looked seriously at why that crisis happened, it happened because of the incredibly deep budget cuts that the state did during the Great Recession, many of which have never to this day been restored. And you can see that we were up to over 19,000 children in foster care at its peak. We came back down. We're hovering around 13,000 for quite some time. It's starting to tick back up. We're over 14,000 as of today. So there is a real tie between how well families are being supported and how their access to necessities and things that they need and children entering foster care. So current issues that we are working on here in this state and really around the country, really trying to address that racial disproportionality. And the main way that folks want to see that happen is by establishing a child or moving toward a true child well-being system where families can access the things that they need, and hopefully we don't have a need for foster care, or we have a need for a very small foster care program where we're not taking 150,000 calls a year, and we can use our resources rather than on investigating and supporting families. We need to rethink both the definition of and response to neglect. Remember, 87% of children in foster care in Arizona are there for neglect. Neglect certainly can be harmful to children, but we need to think about how we're responding to that, how we're defining it. Reducing the use of congregate care. We know that children do best when they are growing up in families, not in institutions. Supporting children when they're placed with kinship families, both formally as part of the child welfare system, but informally. I mean, I'm sure all of you know some grandma or auntie or uncle who's raising a child, and these families need help and support. And then finally, increasing the supports that we provide to youth who age out of foster care so that they can successfully transition to independence. Happy to answer any questions.
Would you say that with our housing affordability crisis now, that's one of the reasons why we have the uptick in kids in foster care?
I think it's possible. I'm not the social scientist researcher, so I couldn't say definitively. But yes, I think with COVID, I think with the high cost of housing, all of those things add to parental stress, and parental stress is what really is at the core of maltreatment of children, and particularly neglect.
You said that neglect needs redefinition. What do you see as what it is now and what it should be?
Well, that's, there are projects that I am a part of both here and across the country where we're trying to figure out what we should be considering actionable neglect, and then what that action should be. So I don't have an answer for you today. It's a kind of complicated issue because it's very hard to know when that neglect is so dangerous that it requires a government entity to step into a private family's affairs. And so I'll tell you the main path for all of these solutions to transform from child welfare into child well-being is really centering on co-design with the people who have the lived expertise and the lived experience with this system. And we are trying to do that here in Arizona through an initiative called Thriving Families, Safer Children. It's happening in other sites across the country as well. Yeah, parents are entitled to representation in these proceedings because they could lose their parental rights. So that's a constitutional right. So they are entitled to counsel if they cannot afford an attorney, then one is provided to them. And I got the hook on time, so thank you very much. And I'm supposed to introduce Kylie, who's going to talk about early childhood education.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kylie Barber, as Molly said, and I will talk to you about the child care system in Arizona. To be direct, the Arizona child care system is facing a crisis. And to put this in perspective, parents spend an average of about $11,000 for center-based infant care and about $7,000 for home-based infant care each year, putting the quality child care options out of reach for many families. For families on TANF or for families below the 165% FPL, there's child care assistance available. Families who qualify choose participating child care provider, and they receive a voucher or a scholarship that's paid directly to the child care provider that covers part of the cost. Providers are allowed to charge the difference between what the provider charges and what the scholarship or assistance pays directly to the family. So even with the child care assistance, the cost is more than a family can afford. Current federal and state programs only serve a fraction of Arizona children. Existing public investments currently only serve about 60,000 children out of a total of 400,088 who are under the age of 6, leaving families to pay high prices out of pocket or with no care options at all. Additionally, Arizona also faces a child care desert problem, and for those of you who aren't familiar, a child care desert is any census tract with more than 50 children under the age of 5 that contains either no child care providers or so few options that there are more than 3 times as many children as licensed child care slots. And 50% of the state in Arizona is a child care desert. That not only includes rural areas, but also includes urban areas, including South Phoenix. During COVID, problems that already existed in the system, including low pay for teachers, frequent turnover, lack of child care assistance for families, and lack of quality options for families, got significantly worse. Families pulled their children from care for health and safety reasons, and because they themselves were out of work or working from home, and many of them never returned, and neither did the teachers. Due to repeated exposures to COVID, programs had to close either classrooms or altogether over and over again. This caused a massive loss of income for child care providers, and of course, which was worse in rural areas. That made the child care desert issues even worse. So now we have less programs who are struggling even more to find a workforce, and the demand is beginning to return. So how does funding for child care work? It's complicated. There are a lot of moving parts, but what you need to know is that there are multiple agencies, funding sources that go through multiple funding sources that go through multiple agencies. What you also need to know is that as a result of COVID, the federal government provided COVID relief funding to states, including Arizona. It was intended to keep the child care system operating during the pandemic. The funding did help sustain the system, but it is temporary and it will run out in 2024, which will leave the system vulnerable unless states can find a way to continue to provide supports. And I also want to highlight that the state of Arizona General Fund pays almost nothing into the child care system. So who administers? Again, it's a combination of state agencies. For a quick descriptor of these agencies, DES administers the Child Care Assistance Program, which uses dollars from the federal Child Care Development Block Grant. First Things First works to improve quality and access. DHS licenses child care programs. DCS administers child care assistance for children in the DCS system. So our system is made up of multiple partners, public and private. State agencies act in multiple capacities as required by federal and state law. In addition, there are community-based providers who actually deliver services to families and community-based organizations who provide support for early childhood systems or programs. Other key information for you to know is the Arizona Early Learning Progress Meter goal is for us to get to 35% by 30, and we are actually going backwards on that measure of educational success in Arizona. Currently, 17% of 3 and 4-year-olds are in quality early learning settings in Arizona. So if you're thinking to yourself that the early childhood education system in Arizona seems like organized chaos, you're not wrong. There are a number of agencies and funding streams that make up the system, and it's easy to think that things are chaotic or disorganized, but it's important to note that they aren't duplicating one another, and there is a concerted effort among the players to coordinate and align the work so that wherever a family enters a system, the standards are the same. Which brings me to ASECA, which is the Arizona Early Childhood Alliance, which CAA provides staffing for, is the shared voice on policy issues for early childhood. The alliance is made up of 53 statewide partners who work together to research and advocate for sound public policy on early childhood issues. If anyone is interested in policy suggestions from ASECA, please let us know and we can discuss it individually or as a group. Thank you. And I can take any questions anyone has. Yeah.
Did you mention the tobacco funds? You kind of really went fast on that.
I'm so, sorry, the tobacco fund?
First things first.
First things
That's
first.
planning your
Yep.
I don't know, it was on the slide and I didn't
Yeah,
hear
it's-
an explanation of it.
Yeah, that was a ballot initiative from 2007, 2006 date, is that right? That's first things first, money quality first, it's right on the second line there. That money goes through that organization. It's about $120 million a year-ish.
Awesome. Thank you.
How do families access these programs?
That's a great question. So depending on, there's multiple opportunities for them to come into the system. It just sort of depends on what assistance they need as the avenue that they come into the system.
Yeah, unfortunately, in our state, and I think all of our policy directors will attest it, in fact, all of our staff will attest to this, that there are 900 application systems for help to families. So if you need childcare, you go to one place. If you need healthcare, you go to another. If you need housing assistance, you go to a third. And unfortunately, there's not a single application.
There's no central place where people can go and just.
No, for childcare assistance, it's DES, or you can go to childcare resourcing program. My life goal, and Kelly got her wish for the whole world, would be one single application going for all of these systems, right? It's very yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about the eligibility requirements. So the way we talked about with the healthcare, the eligibility requirement kind of shifting and not being enough. Is it similar for subsidies and vouchers in the childcare system? And is there any legislation that could be passed to increase the income eligibility requirement?
That's a great question. I'll defer to Kelly back here.
Yes, they're all that way. So as our minimum wage increases in the state, knowing that that's not even a livable wage at that rate, and you'll see that across all of these programs. I think any of the things that we're working on, you'll see that gap. And as that minimum wage increases, families sort of fall off that cliff of services. And so we see those things kind of increasing. And yeah, there are things we can do around that. We can expand eligibility. We can move from basing eligibility on FPL, which is what almost all these are based on, which is a federal measure. And all states have different costs of living, and all states have different minimum wages. So you can move to a state median income. You can move. There are many policy possibilities around that you could pursue. And one thing I will say, even though I was going to say it at the end, but I'll say it now, is that we're going to provide you all with some resources, which includes access to all of our staff to answer these kinds of questions, but also we'll have some information in there about things like that, some policy recommendations that CAA and the AZ Center really think might help address some of these issues. And then as the election season goes along, we'll also be putting out a guide, an elections guide that talks about these kinds of things as well, that might give you some ideas that spark thought on things you could participate in or pursue.
Is the central application process part of that, the policy recommendation?
Well, if I got my way, that would have been done a long time ago, but nobody, for some reason, nobody cares what I think of the legislature, but yeah, that's an absolute thing that we can pursue. And the thing is all of these eligibilities fall across multiple state agencies. I'm not even supposed to talk. I can't help it. I can't help myself. I'm surprised I got this far into it. But these things cross state agencies, and so a lot of reluctance for people to give up sort of their turf at the agency level. And if you talk to the individuals and agencies, they very much want this to happen, but it's very difficult because of red tape. So yes, there are things we can do to make those things easier for families. I would love it if a family could say, I need help on a computer to fill in their information, and then the computer could spit back to them, here's the 12 things you are eligible for and where you can get them. That would
Think
be
about the
best.
savings to the state.
Right.
And
You
all
don't
the
have to
people,
convince me.
like, all the 12 agencies, you know, analyzing one application for the same thing when it could just be one central, it would be savings to the state.
There's some administrative costs involved, so yes. I'm sorry, Kylie.
No, it's okay, thank you. In the purpose of time, I'll be around afterwards. I'm gonna pass it over to my colleague, Andrew, at the Arizona Center. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andy Shagru. I am Assistant Director of Policy and Advocacy with the Arizona Center for Economic Progress. And I think as we finish the CAA portion of today's presentation, if you noticed a through line of all of the issues that we're talking about, it all comes back to budget and tax. And that's what we're going to talk about right now. So if you need to refresh your beverage and buckle up so we can get started. So the Arizona Center for Economic Progress works with advocates, policymakers, and communities to connect the dots between our economy's inequities and the solutions to create a fair and socially just Arizona. You can find us in Arizona communities working with grassroots organizations, in the halls of government, and working here in the Copper Point building, working on research to produce some data-driven insights for lawmakers and communities to work with. And I would be remiss if I were not to acknowledge our wonderful, dedicated, talented, and knowledgeable team members that comprise the Arizona Center, of which Karen, Sarah, and Geraldine were unable to join us tonight, but May is here in the back and is happy to talk to you afterwards as well. So you're going to get a quick Budget and Tax 101 from David Lujan. Then I'll talk about economic well-being, and then we'll round it out with education policy. These are our three areas for when we're talking about 2022 election areas. So there will be a theme going along. So David, take it away.
Thank you, Andy. Get my little stopwatch on, so make sure I don't go over time. So if you're elected to the legislature, I think one of the most important jobs that you will have would be to pass a state budget every year. Unfortunately, our current state legislature has not yet done that, but that is your most important job. And it's the most important because you are making decisions on how we are going to take our tax dollars and how many tax dollars we're going to collect in order to fund the resources that Arizonans and Arizona communities are counting on. So in Arizona, our state legislature has cut taxes every year but 3 since 1990. And there is a chart that I don't have up here that I would show you that would show on a per capita basis state revenues and state expenditures from 1990 were basically going up. And then in around 1990, when the state legislature started cutting taxes every year, per capita spending has been going steadily down. And so that's spending on things like education and housing and healthcare. And so the decisions that you make when it comes to budget and taxes in particular impact the amount of revenue that is collected for the resources that Arizonans are counting on. Make sure I got this here. Oops, I went back. Is there one slide? I think there is one slide before. There we go. Okay. So all those tax cuts that the legislature have been making every year for the last 3 decades, many of those tax cuts have not been going to everyday Arizonans. A lot of those tax cuts have been geared towards the wealthiest Arizonans or to corporations. And as a result, the tax cuts have resulted in what we would call an upside down or regressive tax code. And what's meant by a regressive tax code is that those that are on the lower income side are paying a higher percentage of their income in state and local taxes than those at the wealthier end. And Arizona actually has had one of the more regressive tax codes in the country. And it's primarily because all of the tax cuts that we've seen have forced more reliance on the sales tax. And the sales tax is one of the most regressive taxes, because that is where, if you're a lower income person, you're going to be paying a higher percentage of your income in taxes. And so Arizona has the 11th most upside down or 11th most regressive tax cut. And the recent tax cuts that have just been enacted by the state legislature, the income tax cuts, those are going to make this regressive tax code even worse, because the tax cuts that were just enacted by the legislature last year heavily benefit the wealthiest Arizonans. In fact, the top 1% income, households making more than $500,000 a year, will get an annual tax cut of over $19,000. Compare that to a household that's making just $67,000 a year. They're going to get an annual tax cut of about $47. And so it's a very upside down tax cut. The other impact of that is we lose about $2 billion a year in annual revenue from those tax cuts. And so one of the things that we would say is when you're looking at economic strategies, when you're looking at how we're going to, and that's what, if you listen to the proponents of these tax cuts over the years, they will say we need to cut taxes in order to bring jobs and grow our economy in Arizona. Well, what we would propose is that there are other economic strategies that you should be looking at, like investing in our education system. You saw the cost of childcare and how expensive it is in Arizona. That directly impacts our workforce. If people cannot afford childcare, that impacts their ability to be able to work and get a job. And housing, if you don't have affordable housing, then that impacts our workforce. So these decisions impact the resources that go into being able to have the revenue. Many of the tax cuts that we have seen pass at the state legislature over the years have been tax credits. Tax credits are things that where they're incentives that the legislature passes that allow people to take a dollar for dollar reduction on their state taxes. The problem with tax credits is it picks winners and losers in our tax system. It gives certain benefits to certain corporations often and not to others. The other problem with tax credits is we don't know whether we're getting the return on investment that was promised when we enacted these tax cuts. When they pass tax credits, they say, well, this is a tax credit that we need in order to stimulate our economy, to stimulate jobs in this particular area. The legislature has done a very poor job. There's a committee that's supposed to review tax credits every year to see whether we're getting the desired return on investment for these tax credits. That committee has not met in 3 years. There are some tax credits that are supposed to get reviewed every 5 years that have not been reviewed in more than a decade. So we have no idea whether we're getting the promised return on investment that was promised when they passed these tax credits. Part of the problem with all of these tax credits too is it's allowing corporations to basically eliminate their tax liability to the state. According to the Arizona Department of Revenue, 73% of Arizona corporations are paying $50 or less in state income taxes. They pay $50 because we have a minimum state corporate income tax that all corporations are supposed to pay of $50 a year. But when you talk about tax fairness, when you talk about making sure that everyone is paying their fair share, our corporations in Arizona are not doing that. When you have 73% of the corporations paying $50 or less. These corporations need the same types of resources. They need a strong education system. They need a good, affordable childcare. They need housing in order to fund their workforces. So it's important that all are paying their fair share. So when we talk about tax policy ideas, some of the things that you could consider is increasing the minimum corporate tax. Right now, the minimum corporate tax in Arizona is $50. We have proposed, and there have been legislation proposed, to raise the minimum corporate tax to $100 or $150. At a minimum, you would think that that would be something that we could do. And you know, that's just a minimum policy. And then the other thing is just looking at the policies that will make our tax code more progressive and have the revenue to be able to support a strong education system. Here's an important thing to know. In Arizona, to cut taxes at the legislature, it only takes a simple majority of the legislature. But to reverse those tax cuts later or to raise revenue, it takes a 2/3 vote of both chambers or a supermajority. That's a requirement that has been in our state constitution since 1990. And since that constitutional provision has been in place, it has been virtually impossible to get that 2/3 majority to raise revenue or to reverse tax cuts. So that's why we say when tax cuts or tax credits go into effect, they're likely going to be almost impossible to reverse. And so that is why those decisions that legislators make around tax policy are so critical. I will pause there and see if anybody has any questions. Yes.
Can you, for taxes $50, can you give us an idea about small business owners? How do they fit into this? And it sounds like they are paying, in comparison, there's an inequity there for small business owners versus corporations. Is that right to assume? Can you give us more insight?
Yeah. So when I showed you this slide that shows 73% of corporations pay $50 or less, those are, I always get them mixed up, S corporations, C corporations. The C corporations are the ones that have shareholders and stock. Most of your small business owners are sole proprietorships, or they're what are called S corporations, which are pass-through. And those businesses, those business owners, pay taxes through the individual income tax code. So they pay out of the individual income tax code. And so the income tax cuts that were just passed, for example, when I talk about how those tax cuts are going to impact the wealthiest 1%, most small business owners in Arizona, according to the Small Business Administration, the average individual income for small business owners in Arizona is $48,000 a year. So they're paying that income on the individual income tax code rather than on the corporate tax code.
So they're paying significantly more. And, if the corporation's not paying their fair share.
If you, yeah.
1.47% of $56,000.
Yeah.
Which is what?
Can't do that in your head?
More than 50, more than $50.
Thank you.
It's more than $50 for sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? All right, I'm going to turn, oh, yes.
Is there any way to get rid of the 2/3 requirement to raise taxes?
There is, but it would require a vote of the people. There are certain things that are in our state constitution that the legislature cannot change the Constitution on your own. Only the voters of Arizona can. So also another one is the school spending limit. Those are things that if you want to change or you want to modify, the legislature can refer something to the ballot, a constitutional amendment, but the people of Arizona would have to vote on that to change that. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Andy, who's going to talk about some other Arizona Center policies.
Oh, well, he'll be back. So, so I'm going to talk a little bit about economic well-being in Arizona. And obviously, this is probably amongst the top issues that you're talking about when you're talking to voters. And I'm just going to start us out with we're going to ground us with a pretty traditional indicator of economic well-being, and that's poverty. So here I'm showing the poverty rate for families in Arizona comparing 2011 and 2020. Obviously, these were 2 years of pretty different financial circumstances for families. One was the depths of the Great Recession, and the other one was our very own COVID recession. And so I'm just going to throw it out here. Does anybody know the census's poverty threshold for a family of 3, 1 parent, 2 kids, for 2020? Any guesses? It's about $21,000. This is the census threshold. This is a little bit different. But poverty in Arizona has been historically higher than the U.S. average, and obviously the poverty rate for American Indian, Black, and Latino households has been much higher in Arizona. And while these groups between 2011 and 2020 have seen the greatest improvement as a percent of poverty, the extent and the disproportionality is still there. Look at the gap between white households and American Indian, Black, and Latino households. It's triple when it comes to Black and Latino households and quadruple when it comes to American Indian households. This gap has not narrowed in the past decade. And so, you can be looking at this and say, well, Andy, look, 2020 was a long time ago. I'd really love it if you had some really fresh numbers for us, and I'm gonna deliver. So the US Census deploys a survey called the Household Pulse Survey, and they ask families and households, in the past 7 days, have you struggled with affording your usual household expenses? And the answers they can give are no, a little, somewhat, or a lot. If they say somewhat or a lot, we consider that struggling, if it's somewhat or a lot. This is the share of households that have been experiencing this difficulty in the past 7 days from September 2020 to March 2022. And the scary trend you'll notice here is that we're back to where we were in 2020 in the depths of the COVID recession. And so while the stat of 1 in 3 households can be pretty scary, think of this about families that have kids. This is undoubtedly higher. It's probably like 45%. And think about the groups that I mentioned before, American Indian, Latino, and Black households. It is always higher amongst those groups. And so the other thing I want to just call your attention to when we look at this chart is notice the dip for most of 2021. We can think of some reasons why this happened. Chief among them, in my mind, is the things that Congress did. They passed the CARES Act. They passed the American Rescue Plan Act, which expanded the child tax credit, provided supplemental unemployment insurance, and also issued stimulus checks. So despite, going off and getting vaccinated and doing all these things in the summer of 2021, there was economic cushion there that doesn't exist right now. You can't get expanded UI right now. You can't get the expanded child tax credit, and there's no stimulus checks to be seen. And so these pressures combined with inflation, yes, I'll say inflation, gets us to this figure of 34%. I actually pulled this today, and it's actually 36% as of a couple of months ago. Weeks ago. So it's troubling right now in terms of the need out there. So the natural question you'll have for me is, well, Andy, what are we talking about when we're talking about household expenses? Like, what's mattering the most to families? And again, I'm going to deliver. Thanks to our friends at the State Innovation Exchange and Target Smart Polling, they deployed a poll in Arizona in February and asked families, what are you most concerned about with your household expenses? And these shouldn't shock anybody in the room necessarily. Gas, food, housing, healthcare. These are usually, the last 3 are, old favorites, but when it comes to gas, it's hard not to imagine gas right now. It's the most heavily advertised price in America. Of course, people are going to be concerned about, drive every 5 blocks in Phoenix and you're going to see the gas price. But I wanted to notice 2 things with this. One is that, these food, housing, and healthcare, 63% is a lot. It's been rising for years. This is not necessarily a recent trend for these. And these also just are really basic needs. This is really basic stuff for families. Polling high also, but not at this level, were prescription drugs, utilities, and childcare. And so, to talk about it a little more, this is a really precarious economic situation we're in right now. We do have, while the wage gains that we've had since COVID have been really good in terms of people being out there to get a job, inflation has eaten into those gains and has put families in a pinch once again. And so we believe that Arizona state government should be focusing on supporting those feeling the biggest pinch as the cost of living increases here in Arizona. We at the Arizona Center for Economic Progress push government at all levels to guarantee access to the basics, like food, housing, paid leave for everyone. Having the basics, like these essential elements of human well-being, allows Arizonans to reach their full potential. It improves our living standards and helps shores up the state's economy. We will continue to advocate for the policy change that brings programs and policies that help Arizonans manage rising costs. And so when it comes to our ideas, we have 4 big ones. One is help stabilize rent for more Arizonans. This is both by increasing the availability and amount of rental assistance out there, but also to address our long-standing and deep housing shortage in Arizona. Arizona, if you are an extremely low-income household For every 100 families, there's only 26 available and affordable rentals right now, just according to a recent report. As the state grows, the Arizona state government should take its resources and take steps to make sure that there's enough housing for everyone. That means investing in things like the Housing Trust Fund. That's been a frequent goal of the legislature lately, as well as re-empowering local governments to pass ordinances to address this issue and address unnecessary restrictions that suppress how much housing can be built. Rent will only go down as long as there is enough housing to support everyone in where they need to live. The second recommendation we have here is paid family medical leave. And as this pandemic showed, too many families had to choose between a paycheck and taking care of themselves or a loved one. One in four Arizona workers have access to paid family medical leave to take care of themselves for serious illness. We think that number should be 4 in 4. And since 2020, according to some recent stats, Arizona working families have lost over $700 million because they were sick with COVID-19 and didn't get paid for it. We support creating a system that includes as many workers as possible in a social insurance type system. Third on our list is expanding access to meals through schools. As families feel the pinch at the grocery store, we think that schools can be places to provide meals to make sure that children are adequately fed and ready to learn. By supplementing what schools already receive through federal programs with state funds, Arizona can do away with unnecessary paperwork, meal debt, and the stigma that it comes with getting a meal at school. And finally, Arizona can make some really much needed changes to safety net programs that have eroded over the years. There's plenty of opportunity to improve the cash assistance program in the state of Arizona. That's TANF, for temporary assistance for needy families. There's also the unemployment insurance system in Arizona. There are high barriers and low benefits. I could say that all day about Arizona state programs. The frequent excuse often is we don't have the funds to expand these programs. And if you look at the state legislature lately, the state has more than enough money to expand the eligibility for these programs. These are programs that would help people right now in this moment that are working through this. And so during what may be tough economic times, these stabilizer programs are really crucial to help families stay afloat. And so that's the spiel on economic well-being. Does anyone have any questions? Did I run over? Oh, good. Questions?
I have a general question.
Yes.
Is any of this data and information broken down by legislative district or area at least?
Ooh, great question. I don't know, but I'm going to get you the answer.
Okay.
So when we can talk about like the census, the 2020 poverty stats, yes, absolutely. When it comes to the household pulse survey in terms of the share of households experiencing something in the last 7 days, trickier question. I think they do it by state and metro area, and they don't do it anyway because there's it's not as rigorous as a census, so you have like data reliability concerns in there, and so sometimes even for my stats when we did this on our website, we had to like combine multiple weeks of data together to get a big enough sample to work with it. So.
Could you explain again how you suggest having access to meals through schools?
Mm-hmm.
So you were saying the federal government.
Yeah. So right now the free and reduced price lunch programs that are provided in schools are federally funded and executed through the schools themselves. We think that every student that wants a meal in school should be able to get it, and that they shouldn't be put through a arduous and sometimes humiliating process in order to get access to it. And so some states are just saying, okay, we're going to reimburse, we're going to put in state general fund dollars, and we're going to make this just an easy to access program for families. So if you want to pack your lunch for your kids, if you want you send your kid to private school, fine. But for kids in public school, we can use our state general fund to complement those. And so we have what would be called universal school meals, for students. So.
To that point, some districts may be able to do that without state assistance.
Yeah.
Because you're getting rid of the lunch lady that's collecting the
Mm-hmm.
ticket. So there won't be that staff you have to provide for.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can feed everybody for free.
Mm-hmm. Partly, yeah. David's about here to talk about education funding as well, but
I mean, that's, that's a way
yeah.
to kind of
Yeah.
subsidize that.
Absolutely.
I've known people principals that have done that in their schools, where they got rid of all the lunch ladies, and they used that money to feed all the kids for free, and then nobody had to go through applying for that.
Yeah, there's districts right now that can indicate that a certain number of kids qualify for free and reduced lunch. All the kids get it. It's called community eligibility, but that doesn't reach enough students that are not in those schools. And to get to that threshold, you need to indicate that level of need. It means need to get enough families enrolled in that program and applying for that program, which is just mind-boggling. We know we need to provide this to students. So.
Part of it, though, is linked to the Title I funds that come,
Mhm.
and so it's not just about the meals that
Right.
are received, it's about the money and extra staff members and
Mhm.
things to support your students.
Yeah.
So not just about.
Right. Cool. I'm going to hand it over to David. He'll talk about education.
It's the last piece. All right, this is the last piece, and so education and education funding. So when we talk about economic strategies, I'll leave you with this. So Chris Camacho, who heads the Greater Phoenix Economic Council, I've heard him say many times, his job is to go out to other states and to try and recruit companies and businesses to come to Arizona. And he has said in public a couple of times that when he goes out to other states, when they do hear concerns from businesses about wanting to relocate to Arizona, it's not because of our high taxes. The number one concern that businesses raise when they say about coming to Arizona is our education system and the quality of our workforce. And so when you talk about economic strategies, if you're elected to the legislature, I hope you will at least consider investing in our education system, because here's where we're at in terms of Arizona. Arizona ranks third from the bottom in per pupil funding for public education. During the Great Recession from 2008 to 2014, no state in the country cut more state funding from our public education system than Arizona between 2008 and 2014. During those same time, no state in the country cut more funding from our higher education system, our university system, than Arizona. And while we have been restoring some of that funding over the years, we are still, as you see, at the bottom when it comes to per pupil funding. And even before the recession, it wasn't like Arizona was doing a great job. We were 44th in the country in 2007 in per pupil funding. So we have been near the bottom for almost 2 decades now in Arizona. And that translates into how this impacts attainment in Arizona. Arizona, if you look by almost all of the U.S. national averages, we fall below the national average in many of the attainment status statistics, whether it's high school education or those who have attained a bachelor's degree. We are below the national average in all of those metrics. And you can see how that translates to, that's our future workforce. That's our ability to compete with other states. And so having a low tax code is one thing, but when businesses are looking to come to Arizona, they're looking at what's the quality of the workforce, what's the quality of the education system, and this is where we're at right now in Arizona. And so this is, I think, a real crisis in terms of our state's future ability to attract jobs and to have a sustainable economy in the future. This is higher education funding. Arizona, as you can see, has the highest rate, fastest growing tuition rates in the country in terms of higher education at our state universities. And that is because we have seen such significant cuts in state funding to our state public universities over the last few years. That corresponds to having some of the fastest growing tuition rates. And so if students cannot afford college, then they're not going to be, that's going to obviously have a significant impact on our future workforce. So what are some of the policy issues that you will need to be concerned with if you're elected? In addition to making sure our schools are well-funded, as we saw this year, one of the biggest issues is we have in our state constitution a constitutional spending limit on what we can spend on education. I think this is, you've heard this from legislators on both sides of the aisle saying that that spending limit is antiquated. It's based on 1980 spending limits and what we were spending in our schools back in 1980, and it hasn't been updated. So the only way to change the spending limit, as we were talking about earlier, is to refer something to the ballot or to do a ballot initiative so that the voters of Arizona can vote on that. But as legislators, you can refer something to the ballot. And so you could refer something to either modernize the school spending limit or to do away with it altogether. Because if we're going to increase funding, we are, as you saw, third from the bottom in per pupil funding in public education, yet we're already at our own self-imposed spending limit. So that spending cap is basically keeping us in the basement of funding across the country. So if we want to get out of that, and I can tell you that all of our neighboring states in the past year have increased significantly education funding, we have to address the school spending limit. Another issue that the Arizona Center for Economic Progress really advocates for is when we are talking about funding for public education, allocating additional resources to schools that have high populations of low-income students. Research has shown that when schools have more funding to do things like tutoring programs, smaller class sizes, more reading resources, those resources tend to be needed more in those schools that have high populations of low-income students. So what most states have done, Arizona has not done, but what most states have done through their funding formula is they allocate more funding to schools that have high populations of low-income students. They call it an opportunity weight or a poverty weight in the funding. And so that is one thing that we have been advocating for, is that Arizona should join many of those other states in increasing funding, particularly for low-income schools. And then finally, a suggestion for higher education. Arizona has a financial aid trust fund, a state financial aid trust fund, so you have state financial resources to help make college tuition more affordable. But during the Great Recession, the legislature cut all of the funding, most of the funding for state financial aid, and it has never been restored. So we have some of the fastest growing tuition rates, and we have almost eliminated state funding for financial aid. So that's a bad combination. So increasing funding for state financial aid will make college more affordable for Arizona students, and that directly relates to a stronger workforce as we're increasing post-secondary attainment. So I will pause there, see if there's any questions around education, and then we will wrap up. Natasha.
We talked about the school funding formula. I know this year they had proposed something. Was that a formula that you guys were in favor for, or kind of speak on that?
Oh, no, we were not in favor of that. One is, so if you're going to do a significant overhaul of the school funding formula, you should be bringing in the people that are most impacted, the educators, the school principals. That wasn't done with that particular bill. So one thing, if you're elected to the legislature, I hope you will take the time to listen, whatever the issue is, because we're not seeing that very much in the legislature these days, is listening to the people who are most impacted. But the other issue with that is, and Governor Ducey actually back in 2016 created a commission to look at the school funding formula, what that particular bill was intended to do. This commission was business leaders, school educators. They met for 2 years, and the chair of that commission after the end of it said, we can't just move around the shells of school funding. Before we can reallocate funding, we have to first significantly increase funding for public education. And so that's what we would say too, is that before we can look at whether we're getting the dollars to schools effectively, we first have a funding issue in terms of we're not adequately funding school districts. And so that would be one of our points that we'd make. Yes.
Is there any legislative recommendations that you have outside of funding that can
Yeah, I mean, I think, a lot of the work that we do is around early childhood literacy. So, one of the most critical issues is that making sure children can read proficiently by the end of third grade, because that impacts their learning throughout. And so policies that we will advocate for is making sure that we have, well, again, it gets to funding, but it gets to early childhood funding. So making sure that kids are starting early, whether it's full-day kindergarten or other resources to make sure that kids are starting early and learning early. And I don't know, Kelly, that's your area as well. I don't know if you have other things that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely think the earlier you start, the less remediation you have to do as you go up the chain, right? I think anybody who's a teacher knows that. So, we also have a teacher shortage issue here. And so, funding aside, we have to figure out how to address, I mean, part of that is funding, but we have to figure out how to keep the teachers, the good teachers that we have, so.
I would, your question is like, are there things that we can do without funding? I think if you look at a lot of the research and a lot of the best practices, there's a lot of strategies that educators, professionals have to increase educational attainment. I was a principal of a school for a few years and had a lot of success in terms of student achievement. But the things that we did at that school were things like Saturday school for students that were behind, or smaller class sizes, or additional tutoring, or specific reading programs. All of those things are great, but they all take resources to be able to pay for it. And so,
I also say we have to let teachers teach.
yeah,
So, I mean, we
Yeah.
should probably have policymakers sort of stay out of the way of that a little bit more and let teachers teach, and that makes a difference, so.
so with that, again, this is my last time up here. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to turn it over to Kelly to wrap this up.
Don't go too far, somebody may have a question. I'm gonna be really quick and let you guys get out of here because we want to respect your time. Thank you. Our staff will be here to answer questions. I hope if nothing else, you've seen that we have some really incredible staff on our team. They're great, they're very smart. They're here to help you. In front of you is an envelope. Inside it has a little card, and on the back is a QR code that will take you to a place that has a lot of our resources in it, including this PowerPoint, and some other resources, including budget information, et cetera. It also has our staff contact information, so say you're halfway back to Yavapai County, folks, and you think, I wish I'd asked this question. Good news, you can contact our staff and ask us anytime. That's what we're here for. David's business card is also included in that, but of course you can contact any of us. Any of our staff are available to you all the time. There is a candidate survey. It's noted on the back of that card that we've sent out. All candidates can fill it out. If you get the chance, please do so. And I think Demita just handed you an evaluation, so we're really hoping you'll fill that out to help us know what helps you as you go along. So stay tuned for more training sessions, and thank you for coming. And feel free to stick around and ask any questions you have. Thank you, everybody.